I will go ahead and begin. My name is Duran. I'm with the Climate Center here in Sonoma County, California, and I want to thank all of you for joining us here today. As I see the numbers starting to grow, I'm glad you guys could all take the time to be here for this important webinar. First of all, I just want to say we hope everyone's doing well out there. These are strange and sobering times. Here in California, we've survived so much in the last few years. We've been through fires, we've been through floods, we've been through smoke, we've been through evacuations and power shutoffs, now a global pandemic. And that's really got us all thinking, I think. And as our worlds have contracted, I know all of us have had time to reflect on what really matters. Our families, our loved ones, and this incredible planet that we call home. And that's why here at the Climate Center, we're more dedicated than ever to crafting the policies and solutions that will help us not only survive the current emergencies, but the ones to come, and not only survive, but thrive in the face of these challenges. We do this through all our programs, including our Business for Clean Energy program, which is the program that's helping put this together with our Advanced Community Energy program, which my colleague Kurt runs. The Business for Clean Energy is a statewide network of businesses that's growing and support the kind of programs we're talking about here. And all of these policies, which will be good for both the environment and for business, are part of what we call the Climate Safe California platform, which is a vision of a California that is powered by energy that is clean, affordable, resilient, equitable, and safe. And we're going to hear more about that from our CEO, Ellie Cohen, in just a couple of minutes. So now I'd like to begin the Microgrids Backup Power for Business webinar, which is part of our 4-part Community Energy Resilience webinar series that will culminate with a Clean Energy Policy Summit on August 5th. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that at the end. So first, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. I'd like to launch the first poll question. And let me just, if you'll excuse me for just a moment here. Here we go. So I'm going to launch our polling. We've got a couple polls that we'd like you all who are here to take a look at. There's 3 poll questions, and I'll leave them open for a couple of minutes so you guys can take a look and want to learn a little bit more about you. It's going to help our presenters. It's going to help all of us understand where you're all coming from. While you answer that, I'd like to review what we're going to cover today. And if I could ask Amanda to share the agenda, that would be wonderful. We're going to hear from Ellie Cohen, the CEO of the Climate Center. We're going to hear from Ruben Aronin of the Better World Group. We're going to hear from Catherine Von Berg of Simplify Power. Then we're going to take a little break and watch a short video that's going to highlight some more case studies. Then talk about microgrids as a service with Shay Hughes from Scale Microgrid Solutions. Then we'll hear from Chris Ball of Bloom Energy, Carolyn Glanton of Sonoma Clean Power, and then legislative and regulatory updates from Kurt Johnson of the Climate Center. And then we're going to do some Q&A. We're going to have a little Q&A in the middle, and we're going to have some more Q&A at the end. So as you have questions, please start asking them. Type them into the Q&A box if you don't mind. That would be the best place for you to put your questions that we can answer. You can also communicate through chat, but the Q&A is the best place to do it. And then at the end, I just want to let everyone know we're planning on ending exactly on time at 12:30, as we always do. However, we want to try and mimic what happens at a conference. All of you, you guys remember conferences when we would gather at hotels? You remember hotels? You remember gathering together with people? Those things have changed, but we want to try and replicate some of the camaraderie that happens in those former times. And so what we're suggesting we could do today is when we end at 12:30, those of you who have other appointments, places to go, please feel free to go about your day and go on to your next important work. However, some of you may still have questions. You might want to engage with our panelists a little bit more. So in the same way that people would all gather out in the hallway and cluster around all the great speakers and exchange business cards and ask additional questions, we're going to try that today. So when the webinar ends at 12:30, we invite you to join us in the virtual hallway, where we'll continue the conversation with some more Q&A for additional 15 minutes or so. Some of our speakers can stick around the whole time. Some might have to leave, but that's sort of natural. That's the way it would work normally. So we would encourage you all to stick around if you have more questions, and we'll try and get them all answered. I'd also like to take a moment to thank our sponsors. Amanda, if you wouldn't mind our next slide, an incredible collection of incredible organizations: Terra Verde Energy, Marin Clean Energy, Bloom Energy, Sonoma Clean Power, Monterey Bay Community Power, Simplify, Reimagine Power, and River City Bank. All of those are supporting the work here today. And every one of these organizations, I should point out, is working hard to advance the solutions that we're talking about here today. In fact, you'll hear from some of those people today. We also have some promotional partners, BayCan, and particularly I want to thank the Better World Group and the California Business Alliance for a Clean Economy. Ruben will be talking a little bit more about them, but they are part of the partners that have helped make this happen, and they've helped bring many of you here together. And that's the other thing that I want to thank is all of you, the 400 plus who registered, the 120 plus who are already here with us today, and the others who will be joining us. It is you that are able to make this happen. So I want to thank you all for being here. I think it's time to introduce our first speaker. Before I do that, I want to share the results of our polling. I'll give you one more minute. If you haven't responded to the polls, we would appreciate it if you would do so. First, let me thank you all again for coming, and I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Ellie Cohen. Ellie Cohen is going to introduce the Climate Center's Climate Safe California initiative, of which this webinar and its accompanying series is a critical part. Ellie, I should say, combines two great traits: boundless energy and something especially critical at times like this, a ready smile and a great sense of humor. So thank you for being here, Ellie, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Duran. I appreciate it. Many thanks to Ruben and everyone at the Better World Group and California Business Alliance for Clean Energy, for a Clean Economy, for co-hosting this webinar with the Climate Center. And many thanks to all of our panelists, Catherine, Shay, Chris, Carolyn, and Kurt, and our fantastic sponsors, and all of you for being here with us for this timely webinar today. We're really grateful. I want to take a moment to acknowledge the recent deaths of Rayshard Brooks, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and too many others at the hands of police. These acts are truly intolerable. Many communities of color are at the front line of toxic and polluting fossil fuel infrastructure, with freeways, refineries, and oil rigs dangerously close to home schools and hospitals due to historic redlining and redevelopment. These communities suffer from much lower life expectancies and much higher rates of asthma, cancer, and other diseases than white people and those in wealthier communities. And these same communities of color are being hit much harder by the dual pandemics of COVID-19 and climate. We know that there cannot be climate justice without racial justice. And we stand in solidarity with these communities and commit to greater efforts at dismantling systemic racism throughout our society and throughout our climate and clean energy world. I'm Ellie Cohen, CEO of the Climate Center. We are a policy nonprofit with a mission of speed and scale greenhouse gas reductions starting in California. We're best known for our key facilitating role in the phenomenal expansion of community choice energy, CCAs. And many of you are representing various CCAs who are joining us today. CCAs have gone from just 2 5 years ago to 21 today, serving over 11 million Californians, or a quarter of the state, with 88% clean energy. It's a fantastic example of speed and scale greenhouse gas reductions. But we have a lot more to do to scale up those efforts as we face a climate crisis that is now worse than anticipated and accelerating, threatening all life. We've already activated 9 of 15 global climate tipping points. You may have heard that just this past weekend, a town in Siberia recorded a record-breaking 100-degree Fahrenheit temperature for the first time ever recorded. Those are temperatures that are more like what we would experience in the Death Valley this time of year, not around the Arctic. Fortunately, we still have time to prevent an inhospitable to life hothouse climate, but we have to act soon and we have to act fast. As the UN climate scientists conservatively recommended almost 2 years ago, we have to globally cut emissions in half and start initial drawdown or pooling down of the global warming emissions we've already dumped into the atmosphere by 2030 to prevent catastrophic impacts. So what does that mean for us in California, the world's 5th largest economy and a climate leader? We have to be at the forefront of this. We know that we influence other states and we influence countries around the world. Bottom line is we need accelerated climate policy timelines now. And in that light, the Climate Center has launched a bold and urgently needed collaborative statewide effort that we're calling Climate Safe California to double current state targets for 2030. Specifically, by 2022, we want to achieve 80%, or policies that put in place achieving 80% below 1990 levels and net negative emissions or drawdown sequestration greater than emissions by 2030. There are two key principles with that. It's got to include closing the climate gap to ensure that communities of color and low-income communities are no longer disproportionately harmed. And we have to commit to a secure and just transition for all those workers who are currently dependent on fossil fuel industries and related utilities. We invite you to endorse Climate Safe California by visiting our website, theclimatecenter.org, or you can go to climatesafeca.org and join our email list. We have weekly news updates and actions you can take in California to make a difference every day for our shared future. As part of our Climate Safe California effort, a high priority right now is our Community Energy Resilience Program. And as we enter the wildfire season, power outages have made energy resilience a hot topic, literally. And there's an opportunity now to change state and local policy for clean energy resilience. This new program will provide funding and energy support to all of California's local governments to plan and implement local energy resilience projects that are clean. We've even secured money in the governor's revised budget to help local communities plan for clean energy and backup storage. Business has a key role to play in this. Power shutoffs in 2019 cost California businesses millions of dollars, but there's incredible opportunity to invest in this and help shape our future by being part of this clean energy, community resilient future. So with that, I want to hand this back to Duran. Thanks so much, everyone, for being here. We have a great program today and looking forward to sharing this with you. Thank you, Duran.
Thank you, Ellie, and thank you for that great presentation. I'd like to take a moment to introduce Ruben Aronin. Ruben is a Senior Vice President with the Better World Group, our primary promotional partner here today, together with all of the great organizations and experts. Ruben has led multi-sector coalitions, numerous policy wins. We're happy to count the Better World Group as partners in this and other work that we're doing at this critical time. And I should just mention, in addition to his many accomplishments in the areas of sustainability, I suspect Ruben may be most proud of his mentorship of his kids' robotics team. Robots, very cool. Anyway, I'm not talking about robots, but I want to turn it over to you, Ruben.
Thank you. Hopefully I won't be too robotic in my quick presentation. I'm excited to get to our microgrid panel of experts. But Duran, thank you for the kind introduction. Ellie and everyone at the Climate Center, thanks for the opportunity to collaborate with you and your visionary leadership around climate and around enrolling the entrepreneurial business community leaders from throughout our state to be deeply engaged in the policy conversations that are most timely. The Better World Group is a boutique environmental consulting firm that was founded more than 20 years ago to help foster coalitions to lead and achieve some of the boldest climate, clean energy, clean transportation policies that California has been able to pass and implement, that is really the gold standard for other states, for the federal government, for other international jurisdictions to be following. We are excited to be reinvigorating an important component of the advocacy work that we've done, which is through the California Business Alliance for a Clean Economy. The Business Alliance is a network of more than 1,000 small and mainstream business leaders and business owners, a quarter of whom come directly from the clean tech sector, as you might expect. But the vast majority are mom and pop entrepreneurs who see California's commitment to a clean economy as driving our quality of life, of driving our economy, as well as creating the critical environmental and health benefits that are needed. This is a unique time, as we all know, and radical change is something that we've all had to quickly assimilate and find ways to thrive in. And so we are hopeful that some of the needed changes that have to happen in our policymaking world may be a bit easier because Californians throughout the state, and especially where I live in Southern California, see that when we don't have a lot of truck traffic on our road or vehicle traffic on our road, our air quality actually gets better. The LA region, which has some of the worst air quality in the country, if not the world often, had some of the best in the immediate aftermath of the COVID crisis. But sadly, we're seeing a return to normal bad air days again as the economy resumes and truck traffic, has certainly continued. One policy advocacy effort that the Business Alliance and the Better World Group are helping to spearhead is timely up for consideration tomorrow. The Advanced Clean Truck Rule will be determined by the Air Resources Board that will create a first of its kind electric truck mandate for new truck sales starting in 2024. We believe that that's one of the policy mechanisms that we need to help transform our world. The Business Alliance works as a network of advocates that educate policymakers and peers. And we not only are trying to drive climate solutions because it's the most critical thing we need to do for life on Earth to continue, but also because it can drive our clean economy forward. And we are really needing to lean into the job creation from our clean economy stimulus that we'll need to get out of the COVID crisis. And while we deal with COVID and with the important social movement of the Black Lives Matter movement and support accelerating our activity to ensure everybody has access and to the world that they should. We also need to realize that things like wildfires are not going to cease, and there's a tremendous threat that the preventative power shutoffs are creating to the business community, up to $2 billion in economic activity that are at risk. And not only are we taking a step backwards from another threat to economic activity, which we don't need amidst the COVID recession, but many businesses are having to turn to dirty diesel power generators to have as backup. And we know there's a better way here in the 21st century to be addressing our solutions. And so we're excited to be co-hosting this important webinar to look at both the technological solutions to microgrids, but also to dig into how do we make this business friendly, accessible, and how can we help ensure that local and state leaders are embracing this innovation in a sustainable way to create another way to ensure businesses can survive and thrive with the sustainable economy, not to mention the opportunity for creating important non-outsourceable jobs right here in California. So thank you for the opportunity to share this with our membership. Thanks for the opportunity for this to be one of our first webinars to reanimate our business network, which we have relaunched this summer after 10 years of impact. And we look forward to continued collaborations. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Ruben. I appreciate it and appreciate your partnership. And I'm eager to get into the, tofu, the protein, the impossible meat of our conversation here. And so, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who is going to be Catherine von Berg. Catherine is the CEO and president and CEO of Simplify Power. Simplify has deployed energy and storage systems in over 40 countries. I'm sure Catherine could tell us some stories about that, but we're very lucky to have Catherine here with us today. And she's going to be speaking on the topic of how microgrids solve problems and save money. So thank you very much, Catherine. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Sorry, getting this up on the screen. So thank you for having me today. Important topic as the previous discussions point out. So Simplify Power is an energy storage manufacturing company. We're really on a mission to provide universal access to safe, reliable, and affordable energy to empower individuals and enterprises globally. Within the discussion today, storage and certainly microgrids play a significant role in addressing myriad issues around access to power in the US and globally. And I will get into some of the specific applications leveraging storage and microgrids to solve some of these problems. But top line issues, just immediately, storage and microgrids can really help to accelerate the transition to a cleaner energy future, but certainly currently. And when we think about California, but globally, the economic losses because of increasing climate change driven by CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions, we really need to look at this convergence of access to energy, clean energy, and climate change, and the billions that are being lost in the US and globally because of weather-related outages. In California alone, Governor Newsom's strike force report points out that annually, while 500 fires are attributed to utility infrastructure, annually over 6,000 fires annually are created by environmental factors, heat, drought, and severe wind. So when we talk about addressing power outages, public safety around that, shutting down the grid really doesn't address root cause. And that's where, of course, renewable energy storage and microgrid deployments really play a role. So accelerating the energy transition, microgrids also, of course, allow us to really reimagine the grid. And whether the utility owns these distributed assets or the customer at the site, end user site, the possibility of blurring the line between in front of and behind the meter, of course, software, platforms that come into play. As a company, we work with many different partners that provide a complement of assets that can be built into microgrids, which really is just a dynamic platform to allow different assets that optimize whatever the goals and objectives are, both for the utility, again, in front of the meter and behind the meter, the end use, the customer. Building a more resilient future, of course, and really allowing microgrids and storage and renewable assets to play a role along the entire distribution grid, benefiting both utility and end user. And then, of course, the economic value that I mentioned and others mentioned in terms of losses because of power outages, and in this case, directly related to climate change. So I'm going to go through 5 different microgrid deployments that we have had over the last 8 years. We founded in 2010. I'm hoping that these case studies provide examples of how microgrids in a very tangible way can solve a number of problems and also build a very substantial business case and financial benefit. The first is a series of microgrids that were built throughout the islands in Hawaii. And as early as 2012, there were walkouts by students and teachers because of heat in classrooms, untenable situation. However, what was also very challenging was the estimate that the initial site assessments generated that it would take about $6.9 billion to build in infrastructure that could support air conditioning systems throughout the schools. And when some of our partners in Hawaii looked at those site assessments carefully, they realized the bulk of the costs were because of old buildings and envelope issues, because the classrooms were built in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. And so this idea of microgrids that could be built and dedicated just to supporting air conditioning systems in older buildings, but also microgrids that could be tied into the grid in buildings that have the adequate infrastructure. What that did is it reduced that $6.9 billion budget down to $100 million. And while that's still a lot, it has allowed the school district and other partners to come in and start initially 10 million. And at this point, there are over 1,300 classrooms and 88 schools that, because of the reduction in the cost and the feasibility of solar plus storage, the microgrid just supporting the air conditioning units, and again, looking at buildings that could also grid tie and thereby save money for school systems on a daily basis, this really allowed the school system to move forward, solve a critical issue around heat in classrooms, and move forward. And since 2017, more and more classrooms continue to be equipped with air conditioning. Second microgrid deployment story really started at Stone Edge Farms microgrid. That is a living laboratory, if you will, in Northern California, Sonoma. And their primary challenge was really put forth by the owner, Mac McClown, and that was to completely eliminate their carbon footprint and also prove out technologies and the platform of a microgrid specifically and the economics around it, so that it would be a test bed but also a proving ground for this model. And we began to work with Stone Edge Farm probably 2015-16. We have a number of different installations on the farm, both high voltage and low voltage. And the solution to support their electrical loads, it's a working farm, from organic farming, of course, irrigation systems, wine production, food production, and also living systems and dwellings, conference center, was to have not just storage systems installed and solar, but also hydrogen production to power up a fleet of hydrogen cars. And also, of course, a critical role in many different microgrid applications is a software platform, a site controller, a dynamic platform that can really create an open market, if you will, using AI and gaming principles to create an exchange of what assets, what generation is available on the farm, and what storage is available to meet different electrical loads throughout a 24-hour day. Another challenge, of course, were the fires in Sonoma, the PG&E power shutoffs, and indeed, Stone Edge Farm has been able to island and operate in parallel, sometimes connecting back into the PG&E infrastructure, but they have far surpassed being carbon neutral and providing power reliably 24/7, regardless of grid connection or failure. The third story goes to Hawaii. And of course, this is an airport that the National Guard relies on, as opposed to larger commercial systems at Stone Edge Farm and others. This, interestingly enough, is a low voltage, a 48 volt system, but with a massive amount of storage, 272 kilowatt hours. Their challenge was really to not interrupt operations, trench transmission lines through the tarmac, and to create 3 or more hours of autonomy a day to support critical lighting communications, again, specifically around the National Guard and the hub that this airport represented. So what you see is an example of the battery banks with the simplified 3.8 kilowatt hour battery, 48 volts. As a result of this project, they were indeed able to avoid the transmission and distribution lines, digging through the tarmac, of course, the exorbitant costs there. They were able to easily expand, given the storage technology simplify, and as their operations expanded, so too can the storage along with the solar, and never have had to rely on the diesel generators that were originally installed. The fourth example is Governor Jerry Brown, and upon his retirement, moving to an old family homestead, a ranch in Northern California. This very remote site, of course, does not have electrical infrastructure and is not tied to the grid. And so the Browns were very interested in looking at a microgrid that could manage all their electrical loads, especially as they expanded buildings, car charging, and other types of equipment. And so we worked with the Browns and installed what you see here are our BOSS units, battery-only storage systems with outback equipment. And Jerry Brown visited Stone Edge Farm, and we introduced him to the software platform, the HALA technology, that creates that dynamic marketplace, if you will, in a microgrid, again, to balance all the loads and to work with generation sources and the energy storage. The Browns were indeed able to forego the cost of trenching lines and have been able to shut off the diesel generators that they were first dependent on, which was a significant and important goal for the Browns. And then, of course, the last project is a great example of what can be done all over the country and all over the world. And we do have other projects similar to this, but this is working with the utility within the context of affordable housing projects, where backup power significantly and disproportionately affects low-income residents. And so Pepco, working with us and other partners, developed a microgrid solution such that apartment dwellers in this facility were able to benefit daily because of the solar credits from the solar array, but now the apartment building and the complex represents an emergency hub with the energy storage and the solar. And the economic benefits there daily, but also in terms of not losing access to power and representing a resource for the community at large. I hope I've made it within my 10-minute time frame, and I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. I should point out that not all your slides were showing, but that's okay. We will make that slide deck available to people after the fact. So FYI, in case people were wondering where the slides were. So
did they not show up at all?
Not till the very end. I was able to get the last slide or two up. So yeah.
I apologize.
That's okay. That's all right. The information was good, and we will share that slide deck with our participants afterwards. So thank you very much, Catherine. We appreciate you being here and all the great information, all the great work you've done. I do want to end our poll, and I'm going to share our poll results with everybody. So you should be able to see those now. I'm going to share them. So you should be able to see the results. It looks like a little less than half people were directly impacted by a power shutoff last year. Seems that people are concerned about cost and clean power when considering microgrids. And about a quarter of the people here on the call do currently have a generator as business backup. And about 8% or 7 people have batteries. So that's very interesting. And I hope everyone will take a close look at that and see what you can learn from there. So we had thought about doing some questions here, but I'm going to hold the questions till the end because we've got a lot to cover, and I want to make sure all of our speakers have plenty of time to discuss all the fascinating things that they are engaged with right now. So I am going to turn it over now to our Amanda Begley from the Climate Center. We've got a couple of examples of additional microgrid deployments that we wanted to share with you before we turn to our panel. So this short film was produced by our own Rick Tice. Just to kind of give you a little break, I see questions coming in through the Q&A. Keep them coming. I'm going to ask Amanda to show this short film, and then we'll turn to our panel. Thank you, Amanda.
Even before the wildfires and public safety power shutdowns, we've seen the widespread installation of solar on many businesses in California. Now we are seeing a growing interest in installing battery backup to provide energy, typically solar plus batteries with some automated controls that enables you to disconnect from the grid. California has led the country in the installation of solar, with our million solar roofs accounting for about half of the nationwide total. With the help of numerous state programs, including the Self-Generation Incentive Program, California Solar Initiative, and the California Energy Commission's EPIC program, California businesses and communities are making great strides to expand clean, affordable, resilient, equitable, and safe energy. Here are a couple of examples of mostly clean microgrids in the state. Borrego Springs has a population of about 300 businesses and 3,500 people, including many senior citizens who rely on energy-dependent life support systems. It is completely surrounded by Anza Borrego Desert State Park, part of the Sonoran Desert. As a result, Borrego Springs experiences high winds and monsoonal storms that can lead to long power outages that can be followed by high temperatures when demand for air conditioning is huge. The mission of this project was to build on a community with already a lot of rooftop PV installations, as well as third-party PV plus batteries. It is an example of an unbundled utility microgrid, where the distribution assets are owned by the utility, but some or all of the distributed energy resources, including solar plus batteries, are owned by homeowners and businesses. When the generators are replaced with batteries, coming soon, Borrego Springs will operate with 100% renewable energy and be able to export it during periods of high production or low demand. When PG&E pulled the plug for a public safety power shutoff in October 2019, the estimated loss was $2 billion. Even before that, some of the world's largest consumers of energy embraced renewable power as a commitment to reduce their carbon footprint. Many saw the economic advantage of reducing their reliance on the grid and adding batteries and inverters to at least run critical loads during outages. But you don't have to be a Fortune 500 business to afford a microgrid. In Napa, Alpha Omega Winery took advantage of a power purchase agreement set up by their bank, Farm Credit West. Proprietor Robin Baggett says, "We had no out-of-pocket cost to install the system. The bank fronted all the money, and when it was completed, I signed a 7-year lease. Now I make my monthly energy payments to the bank rather than to PG&E, and they are less than what they used to be." At the end of 7 years, I anticipate that we will have saved around $200,000. The equipment has a 30-year warranty and may last longer, so for the last 2/3 of its life, I'm going to have free power. I keep telling people it's the best deal going. Their microgrid features saltwater batteries, which contain no heavy metals or toxic chemicals, and are cradle-to-cradle certified. In Sonoma County, Silver Oak Winery made a big commitment to sustainability and has been justly honored for it. Solar provides 105% of annual energy costs for the entire system, with 330 kilowatts of batteries and a controller that determines when to charge or discharge the battery. This microgrid reduces grid costs when the solar panels can't quite keep up with demand. The Honda Parts Distribution Center in Chino is a DC microgrid with a 300 kilowatt solar array that powers its net zero energy warehouse. Its 546 kilowatt-hour lithium-ion battery provides backup power during grid outages, increases energy efficiency, and optimizes the system's renewable energy. The Redwood Coast Airport Renewable Energy Microgrid just broke ground and is the first of its kind clean community microgrid in PG&E's service area, providing electricity to 20 users, including the airport, the adjacent Coast Guard base, and nearby businesses. 2.2 megawatts of solar will cover empty land adjacent to the runways, coupled to 8.8 megawatt hours of battery storage. The batteries will discharge during peak evening energy periods to flatten the duck curve or to run critical loads during power outages. We want to take this opportunity to let you know the Climate Center is engaged in a climate-safe California campaign to accelerate climate action to reach net negative emissions by 2030. Our urgent climate policy goals will only be achieved if we close the climate gap and assure that communities of color are no longer disproportionately harmed. There cannot be climate justice without racial justice. And we must secure a just transition for workers and their families whose livelihoods depend on fossil fuel industries. Learn more and please endorse our Climate Safe California platform at theclimatecenter.org.
Thank you very much, Rick, and thank you, Amanda. I am happy now to take us deeper into these topics. It's time for our panel of experts to carry on this conversation. First, I'd like to introduce Shay Hughes. Shay, if you have your slides ready to go, that would be great. Shay is Director of Business Development for Scale Microgrid Solutions, and he's worked in some very exotic locales, including both Tanzania and Washington, D.C. And I see he's joining us from a tropical island virtually here today. Thank you for being here, Shay. Take it away.
Great, thanks so much, John. I'm just going to get my screen sharing up for you right now. Let me know as soon as you can see my slides. 1 second. All right, how's that?
It's not full screen.
It's not, oh, you're looking at, let's see. All right, okay, let's do this. Nope.
There we go.
Still not full screen, huh? Give me 1 second.
There.
How was that?
That's perfect.
All right, excellent. Thanks so much. Thank you. I'll jump right into it here. So my name is Shay Hughes, as Jerron mentioned, with Scale Microgrid Solutions. Thanks so much to the Climate Center for having me on today, and to all of you for joining to dig in deeper on a topic that we all care so much about. So my presentation today is going to be on microgrids as a service. I'll start in the beginning here just by kind of framing the issue. I think Ellie and some of the previous speakers have done a great job of doing that. I'll add a few additional thoughts, start to get into the concept of framing, what is a microgrid, what is energy as a service, microgrids as a service, and then kind of ground that concept in reality and look at a real project. So without further ado, I'll start by saying, I love the state of California. I've been here for the better part of the last 10 years, and I love everything that California stands for, the culture of innovation, environmentalism, diversity of thoughts and ideas and people. But the state is faced with a number of challenges, and we've heard already today, allusions to the wildfires and the public safety power shutoffs that the state is facing and has faced for the last number of years now, and it's a real challenge. And I think as a state we can rise to that challenge and do better. Apply that culture of innovation and ingenuity to such a pressing challenge. I think that it is the nature of the problem is very complex. It's a very large, almost intractable problem. If we look at, now you can see the map on the right side of the screen here is looking at the high fire threat districts, and it covers a vast swath of the state of California. So I think it's time, for us to look at this and think a little bit differently and say, we're the 5th largest economy in the world. It's time to bring California's electric grid that was, started to be designed, almost 100 years ago, and much of it is still 50, 60, 80 years old today. Bring California's economy, and develop that 21st century grid of the future. So at scale, and I think many of the other panelists would agree, we believe that a big, a core component of that future is a decentralized grid, one that is made up of an assortment of distributed energy assets and microgrids. One final thing I'll say on this slide is that not all distributed energy assets are created equal. We take standalone solar as an example. Solar is great, especially for environmental, for climate reasons, and for economic reasons for a lot of customers in California. And we've done a great job at deploying solar solutions throughout the state. But the solar alone does not help us solve this new challenge of reliability and resiliency. So this next slide here kind of gets into, well, what does solve that problem? And this is a webinar for microgrids for businesses. So we look at long-term resiliency options for the C&I sector. On the left here, the first option that many businesses have in California is, well, I can simply do nothing and kind of accept that risk, that PSPS, the public safety power shutoffs, those risks posed to my business. Oftentimes that route ends up being the highest cost solution. Typically, many of the prospective customers that we speak with and current customers, they dealt with costs of hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars just through last year's public safety power shutoffs in PG&E territory alone. So then we look at, standby or kind of backup power has long been synonymous, as we all know, with diesel generators. Many problems inherent with diesel generators. I won't kind of get into it too deeply here, but they are a capital expense upfront. They have reasonably high operating expenses as well, with maintaining them and fuel costs, and some legitimate challenges with fuel supply chain in emergencies, and reliability of that asset itself. When we're talking about outages that have lasted for an average of 2 days and kind of up to a week last year. And of course, they are not necessarily the cleanest option for the state of California either. So we look on the right here and we say, okay, well, what's another option? A microgrid, and as it's depicted here, a microgrid consisting of several different assets. Here we have solar, battery storage, a dispatchable asset, and smart controls. Provides for indefinite resiliency. We've got redundancy in our backups, and when financed through a microgrid as a service contract, requires zero money down and actually annual OpEx savings through that contract. And this is California again, so this is a cleaner alternative to many of the status quo options. So just taking a minute to kind of level set here, I know that this group is fairly well versed and might have many different definitions of what a microgrid is, and we've seen a lot of examples already. When I'm speaking about microgrids in the context of scale microgrid solutions and for the C&I sector in California, we're speaking of single customer behind the meter microgrids. What this means is integrated and controllable distributed energy resources, energy storage, and customer loads. This means that it's a system that under blue sky conditions can operate in parallel to the grid, and in black sky conditions or emergency scenarios can island and continuously operate, balance supply and demand. And we like to think of them at these smaller C&I microgrids as very modular, scalable, from a grocery store all the way up to a university campus and everything in between. This image here on the right just showing a few assets of a C&I microgrid, battery, dispatchable asset, and advanced emissions controls. The solar is not pictured here because it's up on the roof. So microgrids as a service. So we're all familiar with the concept of anything as a service helps alleviate that upfront expense, pushes that expense onto the service provider, and it reduces risk for the customer or for the off-taker. Many of us on the call are familiar with a solar purchase power agreement. Power purchase agreement, or PPA. This is one form of financing that can be considered for microgrids as a service. Another form is more of something that we call an energy services agreement, or an ESA, which is more of a fixed payment for the contracted period, whether that's 5, 10, or 20 years, a fixed fee payment that is not only doing things that a PPA can do, such as delivering kilowatt hours and bundling in operations and maintenance to that cost, but this type of structure also allows for performance guarantees and uptime guarantees related to resiliency and reliability. And different value stacking mechanisms are employed here, in part to provide additional services that will help save the customer additional money with their utilities, such as demand charge management or energy arbitrage. Value stacking can also include things like participating in market operations with the utility or with the Cal ISO, in terms of, and that would be examples of that would be demand response and resource adequacy. Eventually, tying these assets together in a virtual power plant configuration and then participating in wholesale market operations is definitely where we're seeing the market going, and there are some examples of that today as well. But the bottom line here on this slide is really to emphasize that using a third-party solutions provider that can also provide financing for this type of project really alleviates the risk and allows and lowers the cost for the end use customer, making microgrids a much more palatable option and technically feasible today and ready to deploy today in California.
Thank you, Shay. I just want to point out we are at time.
Okay, I will just spend 30 seconds and then cut it off here. So this is that okay, Doron?
Sure.
Okay, great. So this is just grounding it in reality, as I mentioned, a representative project, looking at those different assets working together for a representative day, the grid providing baseload power, the solar producing during the day and charging the batteries. And the output of this, as we see on the right, is 95% reduction in carbon, 100% resiliency, and over 10% in annual savings. So I will cut it off there. Had one more slide, but if anything else for the Q&A, happy to take those questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shay. And I just want to acknowledge that any one of our speakers could provide meaningful content for a full hour and a half here today. And I understand that we don't have enough time to dig into all of the details. We're just trying to give you guys a sense. And if Shay, if you could stop your screen sharing, that would be great, so we could set it up for Chris, who's our next speaker. Thank you very much. And I see Chris has come on the video. Chris Ball is Senior Manager of Product Marketing at Bloom Energy. And rather than spend time introducing him, I'm going to give him all the time that he has to actually do his presentation. Take it away, Chris.
Great, thank you, Darren. Can you see my presentation well?
Yes.
Perfect. So I want to thank the Climate Center for the opportunity to participate in today's webinar. This is certainly a very important topic and something that I'm quite passionate about. I'm on the product marketing team at Bloom Energy. My role is to help match our solution and the value proposition of Bloom Energy to that of the needs of our customers. Prior to Bloom, I was in the solar space developing commercial and utility scale solar power plants. The reason Bloom Energy is interesting to me is when I look at what we need for electricity generation, I kind of put it into a Venn diagram with 3 circles. In the first circle, it's reliability. We need systems that are reliable 24/7, regardless of weather, time of day, because electricity is such a basic human need that our residents and our businesses need, and we need to get that energy in a reliable sense. The second circle is cost effectiveness. So we need to be able to receive that energy in a cost effective way that makes it affordable for everybody to achieve that resiliency. And then the third circle is sustainability and clean air. It's vitally important that we develop energy systems that do not contribute to poor air quality, that do not generate smog, And Bloom really fits uniquely in the middle of all three of those circles. The way that our technology operates, it allows us to build a very, very reliable, cost-effective, clean energy solution. We manufacture these fuel cells in California and Delaware. We sell them throughout the United States, in Japan, South Korea, and India. Just some examples on how we fit into those three circles. So the top customers that I like to pick on would be, when it comes to reliability and why our systems are reliable and proven in the field, is our data center customers. So if you look at Equinix, we have over 37 megawatts of deployment with Equinix in their data centers. We power the eBay PayPal data center in Salt Lake City, Utah, where we're the primary power for that data center. Failure is not an option in a data center that's doing trillions of dollars in transactions every single day. When it comes to sustainability and our ability to fit within our customers' CSR goals, IKEA and Apple are kind of the poster children for clean, sustainable corporate goals. We have multiple installations with both of those organizations. And then cost effectiveness. So we have over 60 installations at Walmart. Walmart is known for not overpaying for any particular solution as a low-cost provider. And we've been able to really work with Walmart on a number of installations, just showing the cost effectiveness of that solution. The technology, when I was in the solar space, I never had to go into the technology explaining how solar works because everyone seems to understand it. Fuel cells are different. It takes a little while for people to understand what the technology is capable of. But as I mentioned, with the repeat customers that we have, once customers are signed into the technology, they really, really start to embrace it. And the way that it works is, we're looking for hydrogen. And the cheapest, most abundant form of hydrogen today is natural gas, which is CH4. So the majority of our systems are running off of natural gas. And the benefits of natural gas is that we have an underground pipeline that gives us 24/7 fuel. Now, the downside of natural gas is in the vast majority of cases, we're actually combusting that natural gas. And when you combust a hydrocarbon, that's where you create nitrous oxide, sulfur oxide, and particulate matter. At Bloom, it's an electrochemical process, which means there is no combustion. And by eliminating combustion, we're eliminating those noxious fumes. These are the things that are contributing to smog, to acid rain, that affect respiratory diseases, that cause lung cancer. These are the issues with combustion-based technologies. The California Air Resources Board did a study, and they showed that 60% of all nitrous oxides in the Bay Area were caused by diesel generators or diesel combustion technologies. So that includes shipping, stationary generators, and vehicles. Now we're taking that CH4 and we're bringing in oxygen from the ambient air on the other side of the fuel cell, and that creates that electrochemical reaction. A fuel cell, it looks like the size of a coaster, but if you can imagine a solar cell, rather than spreading solar cells out, if you could just stack them on top of each other, you would create what we call as a stack. So you're getting a whole bunch of different cells stacked on top of each other, so you get an incredibly energy dense solution. And then if you can imagine getting sunlight 24/7, 365, that's the fuel that we're getting from natural gas. So you're getting a very reliable solution, a very energy dense solution. Each one of those modules that you see pictured here, it's one of those cubes in the middle of the server module, those are 50 kilowatts and they're individual power plants. So if you lose one, the rest of them continue to operate. So it's a very resilient solution. We find them to be quite elegant as well. In the bottom right, you can see that's a corporate campus in Sunnyvale, California. That's where people eat lunch, at those tables right there. They're eating lunch right next to a power plant. The reason they're able to do this is it's quiet, it's not producing any noxious fumes, and it doesn't look very terrible for a power plant. The bottom left, that's a 300 kilowatt system. You can see it's about the footprint of a vehicle. We pair with solar, that's Caltech. In the top right, you can see their solar installation right next to ours. In the top left, that's a data center up at Napa County. We have a manufacturing facility in Santa Rosa, California, that I think is a poster child for micro installations. This facility manufactures sensitive equipment, so they need UPS quality power that's available 24/7 for their operations. They didn't want to bring in diesel generators for a number of reasons. One, the environmental concerns, but two, during a massive power outage, when entire communities don't have power, the availability of diesel is limited. So first responders, hospitals, they're going to get the first pick of diesel trucks. Manufacturer is not going to be very high on the list. So while they think their power is incredibly important, they're gonna be fighting resources against hospitals for that diesel power. So they brought Bloom in to do a 4.3 megawatt installation. There's also 300 kilowatts of solar on site, and we've been able to power them through 7 outages since 2019. Most notably, in October of 2019, during the PSPS events, if you recall, there were a number of days where millions of people didn't have electricity. In Marin County here, I lost power for 3 days. Now in Santa Rosa, because the 2 PSPS events coincided with each other, they actually lost power for over 5 days. And this was because they, even when the power started to come back from PG&E, they didn't trust PG&E to give it consistent, clean quality power. So they actually stayed on Bloom for 5.5 days. You can imagine with other technologies, the ability to power for 5.5 days consistently, it's just far and few between. So we're very, very proud of the work that we've done. We've installed over 85 microgrids globally since 2011. And just in the past 2 years alone, we've protected customers from over 1,200 grid outages. Ron, I see you, so I look like I must be out of time.
That's one way. Thank you, Chris. Once again, I would say there's a lot more that you could cover. I hope everyone sends questions through the Q&A. I would like to just mention to all of our panelists, if you want to check the Q&A, there's some questions that are pretty straightforward. You can type your answers. If we could clear those out of the way before we get to our discussion towards the end, that would be great. So just pop into that Q&A and see if there's any questions that you can answer quickly. Thank you, Chris. We really appreciate you being here and making such a great presentation. In the spirit of time, I'm going to turn it over to our next speaker, Carolyn Glanton from Sonoma Clean Power. Carolyn's a Sonoma County local and has worked in many different agencies as an expert in leveraging local government for the betterment of the planet. And I just want to thank you for being here today. You're going to talk about where the money might come from. So I'm going to turn it over to Carolyn.
Great, thanks, Duran. And I'm assuming everyone can see my slides. Looks good?
Yes.
Excellent. Well, thank you. My name is, as Duran mentioned, Carolyn Glanton, and I'm Program Manager with Sonoma Clean Power. We are a community choice aggregation that serves customers in both Sonoma and Mendocino counties. And today I'm here to share information specifically on the California Self-Generation Incentive Program, which is also known as SGIP or SGIP. And what this is it is a California Public Utilities Commission program, which offers rebates for installing grid-tied energy technologies at facilities. And these battery storage systems can function in an event of a power outage. Because of recent wildfire and the public safety power shutoff events, recent changes have been made to the program, such as the approval of Senate Bill 700, which added funding to this program, hundreds of millions of dollars, specifically for resiliency projects. This rebate program is administered by various utility companies throughout the state. And I will note here that Sonoma Clean Power doesn't establish or verify eligibility for this program. So all the information presented here is based on information taken from the California Public Utilities Commission and the SGIP program administrators. The program administrators are the ones that you would work with specifically to apply to the program. So for current SGIP rebates, there are several different categories. It is available for residential and non-residential, but specifically for today, I'll be speaking to the non-residential piece. SGIP is a tiered program. That means that there's different rebate levels with eligibility categories. And those rebate levels can also vary depending on the location and what territory you're in. This program offers incentives based on several factors of the energy storage systems, such as the watt hour, which is the capacity. The incentive amount declines over time as the market matures. That's for efficiently using ratepayer dollars. And each incentive level is known as a step in the program. A certain amount of money is reserved for each step. And as one step runs out of funding, it is closed and the applications are moved to the next step down. For the general market category, any non-residential customer of PG&E, SCE, SoCalGas, SDNE, D&E is eligible for the general market rebate. Depending on your location, it can vary, but it's approximately $350 per kilowatt hour. And according to the SGIP program, that means the rebate approximately covers about 35% of the cost of an average energy system. There is a resiliency adder, which is a new addition, and that we will get to. There are also 2 additional categories of higher SGIP rebates for non-residential customers, and that is equity and equity resiliency. Both these amounts do mean that potentially an energy storage system could be nearly free, depending on the cost that you get through your installer, but it's meant to, cover about 85 to 100%. For the status of these programs, the equity and equity resiliency categories have been very popular. So they currently are oversubscribed with a waiting list. For equity, I've heard that there's no additional funding currently planned. That may change, I'm not sure. For equity resiliency, there is more funding that is being added. I've heard perhaps a July timeframe, but don't have a specific date yet. And so here's a list of the eligibility for all these different categories. Again, for the general marketplace, you just have to be a customer of an investor-owned utility. To get the added incentive amount for the resiliency, you would need to be a critical facility, and that is defined by SGIP, and the next slide has the list. You also need to be located in a high fire threat district or have experienced 2 or more PSPS events by the time of the application. For the equity category, you need to be a small business, and that is defined as having an annual gross receipts of $15 million or less, and either be located in a disadvantaged community or low-income community or California Indian country. For equity resiliency, this is the great category that has an incentive rebate of $1 per watt hour. This needs to be a critical facility and located in a high fire threat district or have experienced 2 or more PSPS events. And in addition, serve either a low-income disadvantaged community that is in a high fire threat district or experience 2 PS events. So the eligibility on here can definitely get a little complicated. You need to make sure you understand what you qualify for. And there's links to maps here, so hopefully that will help in your eligibility. This is the list of critical facilities. I won't read them all here, but these are all the critical facilities as defined by the SGIP program. And how to get started. So the program suggests that you research local battery installers, discuss SGIP with them to confirm your eligibility. If you do have any questions, you can reach directly out to the program administrators, and you would work directly with the installer in most cases to complete the application process and as well as install the technology. Some things to know about this program, specifically that the rebate comes after the application process is complete and the technology is installed. If the upfront cost is a barrier, be sure to mention that with your installer. Some installers, they say, might be able to help you with the upfront cost. So definitely be sure to talk about that during initial discussions. For non-residential projects, 50% of the full incentive amount is received after installation. The remaining 50% is paid annually over 5 years. So again, you don't get that full 100% right at the beginning. So that's good to know when factoring that in to if this is a program you want to participate in or not. Solar is not required to participate, but we definitely do recommend that you pair your battery energy storage system with solar. It will allow the batteries to be recharged during a power outage, and not only that, but provides a myriad of other benefits. And things can change with this program. There's definitely money always added, the rebate levels can change. So I've linked to some of the resources that you can check on that for yourself. I did want to mention a program that Sonoma Clean Power has launched. It is specifically for residential customers, so may not be applicable to your business per se, but did want to mention it as well. We began this program after learning about some of the challenges with the statewide program and wanted to look into how we could help facilitate that process. We heard that the paperwork is very involved and time intensive for contractors and installers, as well as issues with residential customers being able to afford the upfront costs of installing these systems. So our program helps the participating contractors for our program with the paperwork process, which takes a lot of load off of their, a lot of work off their load, and also provides upfront payment to the customer or installer to help reduce that upfront cost. Depending on which project they are submitting, it can be anywhere from 60% to 100% of that amount. And I provided a link here for people to check that out as well. Again, that is for customers in Sonoma and Mendocino counties, with the exception of Ukiah and Healdsburg, which have their own municipal utility. One program that we do have available for our commercial customers is our new Energy Resiliency Audit Program. And so this we just launched. It is available free of charge. It provides a free energy audit designed to help determine the size and cost of a commercial battery storage system that would allow them to continue operating during a power shutoff. So please check that out if you are in our territory. And here's a list of resources. Duran, thank you for sending out these slides to everyone. Lots of information here. And with that, thank you, and back over to you, Duran.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. A lot of great information there. And again, we'll share those slides that have all the links on them so people will be able to access those. I notice questions are still coming in on Q&A. Please keep them coming. We have one more speaker before we get to our Q&A session. And remember, we'll be sticking around for a little bit of a hallway chat after the 12:30 official end of the webinar. But I'd like to introduce our last speaker, who is the Climate Center's own Kurt Johnson. Kurt is going to speak on policy and regulatory changes needed to accelerate this transition. I see he's working on getting his screen share up. So I'll just say at the end of the day, policy, 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 right, folks? So we are going to have a whole deep dive on this during our policy summit on August 5th. But I'd like to turn it over to our Advanced Community Energy Manager, Kurt Johnson, to start his slideshow and do his presentation on policy here for a few minutes before we get into our Q&A. Take it away, Kurt.
Thanks, Ron. Everybody see my screen all right?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks for the opportunity to sort of quickly hit on a couple policy summary items. So I'm going to talk a little bit on what we're talking about when we describe a microgrid. This is just a schematic of what a microgrid looks like. There's typically a ring for electrical purposes. And the idea is that this can sort of island and operate independently of the grid. These sort of wires going off to the left and the right represent connection potentially with the broader grid. People are probably familiar with rooftop solar here. Larger scale, you've got some electric vehicles that could potentially be grid assets, an electric bus that could be grid assets here as well. There's typically a control person, although not necessarily that large, that controls this whole system. So this is sort of the vision of the future that we want to achieve. The question becomes, well, that's great. What are some of the challenges to getting there? There's sort of both technical as well as regulatory challenges. On a technical level, the question is, well, is there space to have physically located what we're talking about here? Is there, if you're talking solar, space available for PV installation commensurate with the total local electrical load. And then more importantly, and this is a policy conversation, is a question about, is what's described here actually legal under existing sort of regulatory infrastructure? And the answer is actually no. And that's what we're working on at the Climate Center. So right now, you know, people are used to rooftop solar. You can net meter behind your house, behind the meter in your individual home, but not necessarily share power more broadly. So we need to change that regulatory structure. Another problem is that, you know, this person sitting over here as a controller, under current law, I mean, this person is PG&E. There's a giant control station up in Folsom that controls the grid for all of California, or at least the California Independent System Operator Service Territory. We don't have this happening on a sort of community scale now. So we need to change the regulations. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then there's also sort of another policy challenge, namely there's a lot of additional infrastructure which is reflected here. You've got solar, you got batteries, or this could be fuel cells. You know, these wind turbines, these EV chargers would need to serve these electric vehicles. That's a lot of local infrastructure that needs to be built. And that kind of local infrastructure is typically jurisdictional to the local government. They have to install this in a way which is commensurate with the local land use code, town general plans, et cetera, et cetera. And local governments aren't really equipped, at least to date, to do the kind of planning that's necessary to sort of site all that. So a quick summary about these barriers. As I said, local governments don't necessarily have the capacity to do that. We had worked with Senator Dodd's office to introduce a bill called the Community Energy Resilience Act to create a statewide program to support local governments in doing that. That, along with, you know, much of the other legislation in this year's session, was put off because of the COVID crisis, although we anticipate that being reintroduced again next year. And then the other barrier is just this 100-year-old utility model that we have that needs to be updated to make possible the kind of microgrid infrastructure that I was talking about there. Senator Skinner from Berkeley had introduced legislation to move towards addressing some of the technical and policy issues associated with transitioning to this new model. Again, that's something that's going to be put off until the next legislative session. So the bad news is some of the key legislation to get us where we want to go was postponed. There is some good news. A couple things happened in recent months that are commensurate with where we want to go. Senator Stern's legislation, SB 1215, is moving forward. And that, among other things, creates some additional analytical tasks for the PUC to figure out where the critical facilities are to help develop this. As Ellie mentioned at the outset, the governor's budget proposal did include, actually as was approved earlier this week, does have $50 million for community power resilience. And there was a decision by the PUC a couple weeks ago in the microgrid proceeding, and that specifically created additional requirements on the investor-owned utilities to provide information to local governments to start doing this kind of planning that we talked about, to have local governments in the forefront of figuring out how to site all this new local generation. So what can you all do to participate in this policy effort? We are working on a policy summit that's going to take place August 5th. Again, at the same registration site, resilientsummit.net. You can register for that. And we're working on building a broader policy coalition to have a group of business leaders, nonprofit leaders, you know, climate justice advocates, speaking with a unified voice to our legislature and the governor's office about the need for this kind of policy. So I hope you can join us on August 5th. And here's my contact information, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you so much, Kurt. Again, lots of great information, and I would urge everyone to check out our policy summit on August 5th. I'm going to move now to the Q&A. So if you have additional questions, please feel free to add them. If I could ask our panelists all to turn on their videos so that we can see you all. And I'm going to start with a couple of very sort of kind of almost yes, no type questions. I don't know if Catherine is with us, but there's a specific question about Stone Edge Farms. I'll wait for her to come back on. So here's a question.
Sorry, it's indicating that you've turned my video off.
Oh, look at that.
Not
Well,
able
let
to
me. There you
turn
go.
it
You should be able to turn your video back on again, Catherine.
Okay.
Thank
There we
you
go.
for that. There you are. So, quick question for you. If you know the answer, what is the controller that they use at Stone Edge Farms? That's a question from Bob Fabian.
Yes, the site controller is the HALA IQ Edge, and that was specifically developed on the farm over years of integrating and optimizing all the different assets built into that microgrid.
Great. Thank you very much. Another sort of straightforward question is about the Pepco project. Does the Pepco project participate in virtual net metering? Rich Williams wanted to know the answer to that.
Virtual net metering, yes. And I believe detail around that I can provide after this specific session, but the participants, the apartment dwellers are able to get a financial daily benefit from the solar credits.
Okay, wonderful. Now, Chris, I got a couple questions for you. You may have noticed some of these in the chat or in the Q&A, but several people are asking about a sort of a related bundle of questions about natural gas, about fracking, about leaky pipelines, about methane emissions, and there's some skepticism about natural gas, despite it's not being combusted, pointing to the pollution that might happen elsewhere in the supply chain. So what can you say about that? How do you address those comments?
Absolutely. So there's a lot to unpack there, but we'll start with today, in June of 2020, and what's possible now. So the reality is in California, we're using natural gas every single night. There's no denying that. When you plug in your Tesla, when you turn on TV at night, that electricity is coming from natural gas. And the fuel cells today, what we're doing is we're offsetting the least efficient, dirtiest natural gas generators on the grid, ones that are on the margin. So there's a marketable improvement from the efficiencies of those old generation technologies. The other thing is, because our fuel cells are positioned on site, there's no line loss, so you lose about 5% efficiency from that. So today, we're having an impact on having a significantly higher efficiency than the combustion technologies out there. So our starting efficiency is about our starting efficiency is 65%. Our guaranteed efficiency, so guaranteed for the lifetime of the project for 15 years, is 56%, significantly higher than you're going to get from combustion technologies. So if you're using natural gas, what we're doing is we're using a lot less natural gas than you would be using otherwise. And that's just today. Like I said earlier, our technology, what we're looking for is hydrogen. And we had a press release that came out last year. We're able to 100% pure hydrogen through our systems. What's not available today is that renewable hydrogen supply. So if we start looking at curtailment of solar during the day and curtailment of wind, my vision for the future is, let's take that excess renewable for electrolysis, create hydrogen, run those through fuel cells. The technology, like I said, exists today. The hydrogen doesn't exist. So give us a couple of years for that economy to catch up, and our technology is already ready for it. So it's truly a bridge technology to get us to a cleaner, 100% renewable environment.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Chris. I know it's a question a lot of people are asking. We had a number of questions about this particular topic. Is there anybody else on the panel who has any comments about that? I want to talk about fuel cells, hydrogen. If not,
Yes.
I'd like to, yep. Go ahead, Catherine.
Stone Edge Farm has been really experimenting with different types of hydrolysis on the farm using excess solar generation to create hydrogen, again, for their fleet of cars. Hydrogen can be really seen as a long-term seasonal storage source for the farm and in commercial applications. Again, Stone Edge is intent on proving out technology, but also the business model that surely drives the technology and the commercial applications. And so I encourage those interested in hydrogen production to look at what Stone Edge Farm is doing, and especially within the context of the HALA site controller and how the hydrogen is being optimized and integrated into all the other generation and storage assets.
All right, thank you very much, Catherine. That's very helpful. I have a question for you, Carolyn. Someone is asking, they say they live in Monterey County. This question comes from Laura. Does our local CCA, Monterey Bay Community Power, offer a service like Sonoma Clean Power's residential SGIP assistance? And I guess the question would be, do other CCAs in general do this? Monterey specifically, what do you know about that?
Yeah, I haven't heard of any other specific SGIP assistance programs. I do know that many other community choice providers do have battery resiliency programs. So definitely encourage you to talk to your local provider. And if they're not, you know, I mean, we would love to see this program replicated across the state. So if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to talk about it.
Great. Another example about where Sonoma Clean Power seems to be leading the charge. But I think that it would be great to export these programs elsewhere, certainly. We've got a few more questions and they continue to come in. I want to thank you all for that. Here's a question from John Rosenblum. I'm going to share this one with you, Kurt. You're on the call. Is CAISO taking any steps to see distributed local renewables to avoid destabilization that they cannot curtail, like utility scale renewables? In other words, are we seeing microgrids beyond emergency backup?
So there's a couple questions there that, you know, I'm trying to find the exact question that's written in here. I guess the simplest answer is these are pending policy questions. One of the specific objectives of Senator Skinner's bill, SB 1240, was to actually require the ISO to figure this out and envision you know, how interfaces with what we call distribution system operators would work technically, and how you value those resources that would be generated on a distribution scale. There's a lot of technical and policy, both technical questions that are tricky and policy questions that are yet to be resolved, I guess is a way to answer that. So that was one of the objectives of SB 1240.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you for that. So I want to remind everyone, we're going to stick around for about another 15 minutes. But before we do that, as we approach the end of our formal time, I just want to ask Amanda to pop on our sponsor and partner slide again, because I just like to once again thank our sponsors, Terra Verde, MCE, Sonoma Clean Power, Bloom Energy, Reimagine Power, River City Bank, Monterey Bay Community Power, and Simplify, and our partner, the Better World Group in particular, for your support of our programs and of this important work. And then the next slide, please. Remember, this webinar is a part of our series on community energy resilience. There is a whole series, 2 more still to come, one on resilient schools and safe communities, and our Community Energy Resilience Policy Summit. We hope you'll all be able to join us there. And I also want to reemphasize 2 things. One is, we hope that you will all consider endorsing our Climate Safe California plan. And I'm going to send out a link to that in just a moment, so you can just click on that and take a look and learn more. And also consider joining our Business for Clean Energy Network. You can contact me. There's my email address, doron@theclimatecenter.org, if you want to find out more. I'll be sending out that link to endorse our Climate Safe California here in just a moment. But I just want to thank all of our speakers for being here. I want to thank all of our attendees for joining us. And I want to say, hey, let's step out into the hallway and have a little bit more of a conversation. So thanks all again for coming, but let's keep this going. If you can stick around, we appreciate it. If you need to go, thanks for being here. But let's spend a few more minutes, and thank you, Amanda, for sharing those slides. Here's a question from Terry Taylor. It came in early, and Leslie Peterson answered it, but I think it's good for the whole panel. How far away are we from realizing community microgrids? The question starts with, should we be building facility microgrids so they can easily connect with community microgrids when they're permitted? How far away are we from actually realizing that vision? And anybody want to raise their hand? I'd be curious. I know Kurt's got some thoughts about this. Go ahead, Kurt.
So It really depends on how aggressive we're willing to be with policy development in California. To answer the question directly first, yeah, it starts with a huge acceleration of sort of customer-sided distributed energy resources, or behind the meter. And that's where we are now. In his video, Rick talked about, hey, there's 1 million solar roofs in California. And then that starts to becoming paired with behind the meter storage, which is being added. So there's a lot of sort of push now to add battery storage to existing distributed solar resources. And that's very powerful, and that's happening. It gets really interesting once you start allowing all of that behind the meter, both solar and storage, to talk to one another. And so there's kind of a whole policy question. I mean, right now, various CCAs are specifically enacting programs to aggregate all that behind the meter storage and use that to provide something called resource adequacy to sort of ensure resilience for the local utility. And then ultimately what needs to happen is we have a transition to what we call a sort of an open local electricity market, so that all those behind the meter generation and storage assets can participate in a local electricity market and get value paid to them commensurate with the value which they're actually in a position to provide to the local distribution grid. So that's why this ultimate policy vision is so important. I think that the transition we're talking about here is at some level inevitable. If you look at the declining costs for solar and storage and clean distributed generation generally, you know, we're going to get there eventually. The question is how fast. And so the question is, you know, on a policy level, how fast can this policy be driven in Sacramento? A lot of us were hoping that the PG&E bankruptcy and the associated need to revisit all things associated with PG&E would help accelerate this. That has not happened, as people are probably aware. It looks like the bankruptcy is going to be resolved, and the net effect is it's kind of like, you know, the new PG&E is going to be in many respects similar to the old PG&E. So that has not turned out to be the aggressive driver of change that many of us had hoped. And you know, there are pockets of really interesting work being done, particularly by CCAs in California, including Sonoma Clean Power, MCE, and others. Various Bay Area CCAs have some really innovative policy around this. So I think what's likely to happen is, you know, the innovation is going to continue to happen, is particularly by CCAs and by businesses, and then we will see whether or not there's an appetite in Sacramento to really accelerate this policy agenda. Like I said, because of COVID, a lot of some of these more aggressive policy recommendations weren't going forward in the last couple months. And I think that we're going to see a whole new opportunity next legislative year. Again, that's the purpose of our policy summit coming up on August 5th, to try to get consensus about, you know, where we want to go, and then what are some key steps that can be taken. You know, there are some good signs. Like I said, there was a decision that came out of the PUC June 11th that was directionally important in terms of getting information in the hands of local governments to start planning community microgrids. The so-called track 2 of that decision, which needs to be decided by the end of 2020, will, among other things, hopefully create a tariff so that there starts to be a local market for the energy value that microgrids can bring to further accelerate their development. And we'll see how that goes. That's going to be really important. But at the end of the day, you know, ultimately this is going to depend on how fast the policymakers in Sacramento are willing to drive this transition.
And the one comment, if I may, as a follow-up, is policy certainly can drive and speed the process up. But as a company that is in the market and deploying systems and working with a network of strategic partnerships, from inverter charge controller manufacturers to software developers, the market itself, and market forces, meaning the consumer and their purchasing decisions, are very much going to drive the market, whether the policy is there to support it or to create incentives, as we see the market is already shifting and new opportunities are happening, whether or not policy is at the forefront driving it or even supporting it. And so I wouldn't underestimate purchasing power, market forces, and what you brought up, Kurt, and all of us are seeing and feeling, certainly in California, the US, but globally. The pain points, the economic fallout from COVID alone. And then you think about the power outages and the economic fallout last year with just PG&E estimated to be about $2 billion. Globally, damages and economic losses from natural disasters, it's estimated to be about $335 billion. Add that on to the economic losses of about $45 billion because of power outages. So you've got the economic losses of climate change, weather-related incidents, power outages that happen, now COVID and the shutdown of the economy. These are real issues that businesses certainly are feeling, and the innovation when it comes to the hardware and the software, and again, this idea of blurring the line between what's in front of and behind the meter. To the question specifically, how soon will community microgrids happen? Well, I believe in aggregation, as software platforms are able to make connections between hundreds of homes or 5 homes and a business and a community center or a hospital, the market finds ways, whether the policy is there or not. And again, I really think that the economics and the pain points around the economy are going to drive much of the innovation. I can only hope that the policy is there to support it and accelerate it.
Thank
So
you.
we have a case study on this very topic. If you're interested, Dorn, if you want to continue talking on this topic, because it's pretty important.
Yeah, I wanted you to have a. I saw you were trying to contribute. I think Shay has something he wants to say too. So, okay, I'll go to Chris. Go ahead, Chris.
Sure. So just to tell you what's possible when people are properly motivated. So the city of Hartford, Connecticut had a 11-day power outage. I believe it was in 2011. And following that power outage, they were motivated to try to find a better solution. So we ended up installing a fuel cell-based microgrid to power a community center, a senior center, a gas station, an elementary school, and a grocery store. So all of these facilities are co-located on one block. We put 800 kilowatts of fuel cells in. And when the grid is available, they take all the power they can. The excess power is then sold at retail rates to the other buildings that the government owns. So it's a virtual net metering program. When the grid's not available, and we powered them through 7 power outages in the past couple of years, we're able to power all those facilities, which are all critical facilities during emergency. So that works. The technology is there. It's what we've been talking about. It's all policy. So I was hoping that with last year's PSPS events that California would be more motivated to create these kinds of virtual net metering programs, which make it more possible from an economic perspective, but technologically we're there.
Okay, so there's a sort of a follow-up question that's related from Kevin Conway. Could we build microgrids like that, like what Stone Edge Farms did, what Hartford did, or do we still need pending legislation to pass for this closed loop? I think we may have answers, but I want to be perfectly clear about where we stand in California.
We still need legislation. It's not legal to do a community microgrid right now. There's all sorts of sort of legacy structure having to do with, you know, the 100-year-old regulatory infrastructure that we have right now. So in order to do what we want to do, we need, you know, legislative and regulatory reform.
Got it. Clear. Thank you very much, Kurt. Shay, you had something you wanted to add.
Just echoing Kurt, I mean, very specifically, we're talking about one rule in the Public Utilities Code known as the over-the-fence rule, Public Utilities Code 218. That's something that we and many others are advocating for reform of that piece of the code. It was built for, you know, very legitimate concerns when that code was designed, and now I think it's something that, you know, it needs to be brought into the 21st century. It needs to be modernized. You know, we've got the protections, we've got the safety, the technologies that would allow community microgrids to come online and flourish, but the policy has to catch up. So just echoing Kurt.
Got it.
So just to clarify, Senator Stern's bill, SB 1215, in an earlier version actually did have a provision that would have taken some initial steps towards, say, getting around existing Section 218 restrictions. That was stricken from the bill recently, so that's no longer part of SB 1215, which is unfortunate.
Well, thank you, Kurt. So as long as we're talking about the CPUC, I got a question from Jan Dietrich. Are you guys all advocating that the CPUC reform transmission access charges? So here we get into some geeky stuff, which I love. Kurt's got a comment.
No, that's a yes. It's kind of it's a long, complicated story, but I would imagine that everybody on this panel would say yes, that the distributed energy resources need to be paid commensurate with the value they bring to the grid, and no longer be needing to subsidize some costs which are effectively reinforcing the status quo.
Great. Anybody disagree with that? Nope.
No.
We're all in agreement. Carolyn's thinking. All right. No problem. So I've got a couple more questions. This conversation is really interesting. I see we've still got, about 80 people still on the line here. So let's have a couple more conversations. If anybody needs to leave, of course, feel free to let us know. I know, Shay, you have something else coming up soon. So if you need to take off, just give us a heads up. But here's another interesting question, and I'm going to throw this out to the group. The specific question from Lane Sharman is, do any of the panelists see a need for an open conference on vehicle to grid? And I would expand that question and just say, where does vehicle to grid fit into all of this? Is that also something that needs a policy push? Is that something that's currently available? A lot of people worry about power shutoffs and wonder about using their electric car. I know we're a little behind Japan and Europe from a technology perspective, but it's sort of an interesting one that connects EVs to this issue. I'm curious what anybody on the panel would say about that. Kurt's hand is up, and then Shay goes next.
So the short answer is that's far and away potentially the most fabulous innovation that is for us today, which needs to be seized upon. So there's a huge amount of battery storage that's going to be on wheels that will become available as the public increasingly buys electric vehicles. And so that the ability to harness all of that mobile storage to do local balancing the electric load and to allow electric vehicle owners to get paid to export is enormously game-changing in creating a future world that we can achieve. So in order to get there, you need to have all the electric vehicle manufacturers be supportive of and having that kind of exporting, not voiding warranties associated with the battery storage in the electric vehicle. And you also need to have technology widely available which allows that vehicle to grid exporting, and there are some companies that are specifically working in that space. And then you need to have utilities create the programs to create the price signals so that those electric vehicle owners can do just that. I believe that actually Sonoma Clean Power has a program to do just that.
We aggregate EV charging stations that are used in residential and use that for price signals to reduce our peak demand. So yes, we have that, and I definitely do think the vehicle to home, vehicle to grid plays a part in the community microgrid space. I think there's just a little bit more to really work on some of those details and the technologies.
Thank you, Carolyn and Kurt. Shay, you had your hand up. I want to give you the floor.
Sure, I'll just jump in really quickly and say, from the C&I perspective, we're working with several transit authorities in California right now, and the concept of vehicle to grid comes up. These bus batteries are, several times larger than, civilian car batteries. And one stepping stone, I think we're still several years, if not more, away from true vehicle to grid in California. But one stepping stone is vehicle to microgrid, right? When you're deploying these assets and these technologies behind the customer meter, and you've got a balance of supply and demand, loads and energy generation and storage technologies, you're able to utilize that vehicle asset in a vehicle to microgrid capacity. And there are a lot of learnings to be taken on from that first step to then better prepare for ultimately like a true vehicle to grid, vehicle to macro grid scenario.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I just got to take a couple more questions before we wrap. This is a follow-up in the spirit of conversation. Someone wanted to ask a question. This comes from Michael Zimmerman. The group of 3+ adjacent hosts wanted to disconnect from the broader electricity grid altogether, just like shut themselves off and island themselves and sell share power amongst themselves within a microgrid. Is that still illegal under Rule 218? And I guess that's a simple yes or no. Kurt, you're laughing.
Well, I'm not an attorney, okay? So, you know, the monopoly utility franchise, well, any individual, yeah, you can, you know, I have solar on my roof. I could unplug entirely from PG&E. So as an individual, whether or not I could sort of convince all my neighbors to do that at what point is PG&E, they're going to say, well, wait a minute, this is a problem. And, you know, we have this monopoly franchise that's been granted to us as a condition of service. This is a very live issue, which is going on right now. It's being tested in proceedings before the PUC. It's being tested in courts. It's kind of what's being described here is a slightly expanded version of the fights that we've had over net metering over the past 30 years. And so what's happening is people are saying, hey, can I aggregate? And so I think at some level, on a technical level, this is going to start happening. And that becomes very problematic from a societal level, because if the wealthy people are doing that for themselves or with their wealthy neighbors, that's going to leave everybody else out in the cold or in the dark. And so this is happening anyway, right? So that the imperative to systematically plan and deploy resilient, clean community energy microgrids, specifically to prioritize the low income and least well-off people in our society, this is critically important now. So that's why SB 1314 and the other policy efforts we're advocating for are so important, because what was just described is going to happen anyway. And if we don't sort of intervene on a policy level, the least well-off among us are going to be most sort of poorly impacted.
Wonderful, Kurt. Well, I want to thank everybody. I know a couple of our panelists have had to leave. I'm sure other people have other things to do. We talked about 15 minutes or so to stick around. I just want to give the panelists who are still here the opportunity. Is there anything else you want to say to follow up on any of the questions that we've discussed? I don't see any hands going up. So I just want to thank everybody who attended this today. I really want to thank our sponsors. I want to thank our speakers. And you, the attendees, thank you for being part of this. Please stay connected. We hope to see you all on August 5th at our Policy Summit, as well as other webinars and events that we're going to be hosting here during this interesting time. So thanks again for everybody being here. Thank you, Ruben and the Better World Group, for being part of our coalition. And we look forward to working with all of you, Chris and Catherine, Kurt, and everybody. Thank you for being here. I'm going to end this webinar now, and I thank you all. We're coming on to Wave to thank you all for joining us. So thank you all, and we'll see you all again soon.
Thank you
take
so
care.
much.
Very much for the opportunity.
All right.
How do I leave?
End. Bye.